Right, guys, welcome back to another episode of the League Express podcast. My name's Jake Kearnan, and joining me as always is the editor of League Express, Martyn Sadler. And Martyn, heaps to discuss this week, mate. It's all happening over there.
Good morning, Jake. There's a lot happening. There's no doubt about it. We've had Andrew Abdo coming over and then presumably returning to Australia. We've had John Cartwright departing as the head coach of Hull FC. We've had what appears to be Brian McDermott being appointed as the New England coach for the World Cup this year. And we've had Rhodri Jones being appointed as the interim chief executive of the Rugby Football League following the departure of Abi Ekoku to St Helens. So it's, quite a lively sort of 7 days since we last spoke, or is it 6 days? I'm not quite so sure. But whatever it is, it's been there's certainly been quite a bit going on. So quite a bit to talk about, mate. And we'd better get into it, hadn't we? As well as all the games, of course. Let's not forget those.
Absolutely, mate. Sometimes, rugby league, it provides as much off the field as it does on the field, which certainly keeps people like you and I happy who have a lot to discuss when it comes to recording the podcast.
Absolutely, yes.
Um, Mate, let's touch on the weekend's matches really quickly, mate. What was the match that impressed you most over the weekend?
Well, it depends what you mean by impressed, but the event that impressed me most, in a sense, was the Thursday night game between Hull FC and St Helens. It ended up 14 points to 24, a win for Saints, who have done remarkably well this season, actually, to say they've had a lot of injuries. It's been a great season so far for Paul Rowley, the new Saints coach. But what was interesting about it, obviously, was the reaction to John Cartwright. I think the whole crowd, all the Hull supporters had learned that Hull had more or less said to Cartwright that they weren't going to retain him next year. And Cartwright had responded quite emotionally to that news. He'd been interviewed by the Hull Live website the previous Monday, and more or less said that complained bitterly about the way that he'd been treated in the way that news was imparted, and certainly the Hull fans. Everybody likes John Cartwright at Hull, seemingly apart from the Hull directors. They've all appreciated the improvements that have been made under his tenure. And I mean, they rose last year to seventh place. They just didn't quite make the playoffs, but that was a hell of a lot better than I think they were 10th or 11th the season before, and which had been a miserable season, really. And they were doing not too badly this year, but again, suffering a ridiculous number of injuries, unfortunately. So, the crowd really got behind them for the St Helens game, and the players, I thought, gave everything. There was one, really notable incident. A young Logan Moy, who I think's a real player of great promise, pulled off an absolutely thrilling tackle on Tristan Sailor, bundling him into touch when Sailor made a break over most of the length of the field. Logan Moy came across right across and cover tackled him and pushed him into touch. And that was a great moment. And it sort of showed the commitment, and Moy scored a try, and you could see also, the emotion behind it as the Hull players, congratulated each other on, every time they scored a try, but they didn't quite have enough in them to beat Saints. But the fascinating thing was that Richie Myler, the managing director of Hull FC, every time he appeared on the big screen, he was booed. Every time Cartwright appeared, he was cheered. And then at the end of the game, a lot of the Hull fans stayed behind with banners very supportive of Cartwright, to say, we love you, John, and we hate to lose you, sort of thing. But then the following day, on the Friday, it was announced that Cartwright would indeed be stepping down, although oddly enough, it did say he'd continue to be employed by the club. I'm not quite sure doing what. I mean, who knows what his current role is after being relieved of the coaching duties. But Andy Last has stepped into his shoes as the interim head coach. I don't know whether that will be to the end of the season or not. I suspect probably not, but who knows? And Andy Last has inherited quite a difficult job because, right from the start, I think, he'll be offside with the Hull supporters, who no doubt will still be supportive of Cartwright, and I just think the whole thing was very badly handled. If you're going to relieve a coach of his duties, and at the end of his contract, you simply make a joint announcement with the coach and make sure that everybody's on the same page, and you make sure you keep your coach fully informed of what's going on. Now, obviously, I'm not sure about who did what, because the other thing about Hull as a club is that they're not that good at their media relations. They don't, Andrew Thurkill, the owner, as far as I'm aware, doesn't speak to the media. He's certainly never spoken to me, for example, and I suspect that's true of most people who write about rugby league. So, they don't get their side of the story out very well, I'm afraid. And inevitably, in those circumstances, you tend to get some negative stories. And as I say, they do seem to have messed up this situation with John Cartwright, who is certainly, in my experience, a really decent guy. And, there's a lot of talk that Andrew Thurkill didn't like him because he thought he wasn't tough enough on the players and in areas such as discipline and fitness and so on, which may be true. I mean, there's always, no smoke without fire, they might say. But nonetheless, it's just that a lot of rugby league clubs are very poor at communicating what they're doing, and Hull have been the absolute prime example this last 7 or so days, and it's disappointing because they're a big club, they're a great club, and they ought to be able to handle things a bit better than they have done.
Yeah, mate. And, we saw those scenes after the match, and it's kind of hard to believe that they, want to let him go when he apparently, or looks like he has the support of the full playing group. Have you ever seen anything like it?
No. I mean, normally, it's funny, isn't it? When a team is doing well, when a team rather is doing badly, the first people who want to sack the coach are normally the fans, aren't they? Very often you find that a head coach is sacked because the fans, rebel against him, really. And you find that in football, in rugby league and other sports and so on. Coaches who have a record of failure soon, the fans' backs soon get up, don't they? They get very annoyed very quickly. But this is a very strange situation where it seems the club's directors didn't rate Cartwright, but the fans certainly did. So and inevitably there've been one or two stories coming out about errors that Cartwright supposedly made. For example, Liam Knight, the player who went back to Australia a couple of months ago, apparently Cartwright assured the Hull directors that he'd be here for the whole season, and it was a bit of a shock when he decided to go home. But of course, he's engaged to a lady who's a very well-known broadcaster in Australia, so it was probably not an unlikely thing that he'd want to head back and pursue that relationship over there. So. There's a bit of all sorts of little things that come out that sort of suggest why the Hull directors weren't that happy with Cartwright. But the real thing, the real reason why they're not higher up the table, and I thought they'd be a shoo-in for a top 6 place this year. But the real reason why they're not at the moment is because they've had such a lot of injuries. And that was compounded in the Saints game by Sam Lasoni, who's apparently got a pec muscle injury that needs surgery, and he's going to be out for 12 to 16 weeks. And he's a big, strong guy who will always score tries from near the opposition line, so he's going to be out. Herman SAS isn't back yet, or at least wasn't last Friday. He should be getting back fairly soon, one would hope. But but they are struggling for having a team that can play at full strength at Hull, and that's the reason why they're not perhaps doing as well as you might think they would do. But I'm just checking. Yeah, they play at Castleford this Friday night, which will be a really interesting game for them, I think. It'll be interesting to see how many fans from Hull follow them to Castleford and what the reception is that Andy Last gets when he walks out. And it'll be interesting to see how the players perform for Andy Last at Castleford, because the big result at the weekend just gone was on Sunday, of course, when Castleford won at Wigan, which nobody predicted, apart from perhaps Liam Carr, the Castleford coach. I'm not even sure that he would have thought they would have won there, but a great performance. And Wigan have lost 3 league games in a row now, which is startling, actually, Jake. And a few weeks ago, Wigan were at the top of the table with 5 wins from 5 games. Everybody thought, oh gosh, they're going to run away with this, and yet they've now lost at home to Huddersfield and Castleford. I mean, it's not as though they're losing at home to teams at the top of the table. They're actually losing to teams that have been struggling. So obviously they're without Bevan French at the moment, and Harry Smith has been suspended for 3 games for an incident in their match last week. But that was in the Challenge Cup at Wakefield. But it's still surprising to see them struggling in that sort of way.
And it almost leads me to my next question, mate. It was going to be, what was the biggest surprise of the weekend? I think you'd probably say that match was probably one of the biggest surprises.
Absolutely, no doubt. 24-14. So the same scoreline, by the way, that we saw at Hull on the Thursday night. 24-14, but this time Castleford beating Wigan. And the really impressive thing about that, Jake, is that Wigan were winning 14-6 at half-time. So Castleford scored 18 points without reply in the second half. And it was an amazing performance. They've got one player who I think is playing particularly well, played particularly well in that game. And that's this centre, Christian Mapapalangi, who looks a great signing at the moment for Castleford. And, I hope he manages to avoid injury throughout the season. He's playing extremely well, and he's formed a very good relationship, it seems to me, with Jason Gary, the Castleford winger, and they tore Wigan to bits, it seems, on Sunday, and obviously very disappointing from Wigan's point of view, but thrilling, absolutely thrilling from Castleford's point of view. And it reminds me, actually, just tell you a little story about League Express going back to the very early days when we first launched in the 1990s. There was one really interesting occasion when Castleford travelled to Wigan, and against all the odds, they won at Wigan back then. And our match reporter at the time wrote a match report, and he was a regular Wigan match reporter, and he wrote a report about the game, saying that game was the dullest, most awful, shocking game that he'd seen for an awful long time. It was just a dreadful match, and Castleford won it. And we were besieged by letters from Castleford fans who'd been at the game saying it was the most thrilling, exciting game that they'd ever seen. And who the hell was this reporter who claimed it was an awful game? And it sort of taught us a lesson, really, in a way, that you've got to tell your reporters to see things from both sides. You can't just report on a game from the point of view of one side. If you've always got to recognise that the team that wins it is probably going to be very happy about it, and their fans are going to be happy, and they probably won it because they played well. And I always try and make sure that we can't be accused of bias, either for or against any particular team that we report on.
Yeah, that's right, mate. Got to try and stay
Stay
completely
neutral.
objective and impartial. But
Absolutely.
yeah, just on that Papalangi, he came from the New South Wales Cup system. I believe Chris Chester spotted him, plucked him out of that New South Wales Cup comp to bring over to Cass, and I feel like he's done that with a few players now. He's starting to build a bit of a reputation by identifying
He
this
played a
young
few games
talent.
for West Tigers. I think he played a few games for West, didn't he, Papalangi?
Mm, yeah.
But never became an absolute regular. Which, but I would think. I mean, it's quite interesting, isn't it? That bearing in mind that a couple of new clubs are coming into the NRL in the near future, Perth next year and PNG the following year. I would think that those two clubs would be looking very extensively at players in Super League at the moment, and I would think a player like Mapapalangi might well be the sort of player who will, be looked at very closely by Perth, for example, as a potential signing for next year. I'd certainly be amazed if he wasn't, to be frank.
Yeah, no, for sure, mate. Just on Wigan though, we've touched on the players that they were missing last week, and should Wigan fans be starting to worry?
Well, I don't know. The thing about Wigan, they're a strange club in some ways because they very often have a blip at some time during the season. It's not uncharacteristic for Wigan to put in some very disappointing performances, usually about the middle of the season. And but it seems to have come a bit earlier this year. But the thing about Wigan, Jake, is that they always seem to be able to raise their game when it really counts. For example, against Wakefield in the Challenge Cup, they raised their game sufficiently to get through, even though it was only by 4 points. And they're through to the semi-final now, and they'll play St Helens in a few weeks' time. And, don't assume that they won't be up for that one, because I'm sure they will. They are missing Bevan French, of course. And as I say, they were missing Harry Smith. He's suspended. He's got 2 more games to go, in fact, as has Sam Walters, who was also suspended for a headbutt against Wakefield. And I must say, he was very lucky, or Wigan were very lucky, that the referee in that game didn't spot the headbutt that Sam Walters gave Jay Pitts, because if he had done, he would have sent him off. And Wigan might have ended up not winning that game in that case. But so they were quite fortunate there, really. But I wouldn't, the lesson of rugby league, Jake, is that you never write Wigan off. They will be a danger to anybody at any time, and you just don't. Interestingly, they're playing at Warrington this Friday night, and that's going to be one hell of a game, isn't it? Let's face it. So, who knows what's going to happen there? I'm trying to make my mind up because I take part in the media tipping competition, and I can't make my mind up what to do about that game this week, and in fact a few other games as well are pretty hard to predict, to be honest, Jake. And I'm doing very
Yeah,
well in the competition so far. I'm up with the leaders, but whether I will still be at the end of this next round, I'm not quite so sure.
mate. Are you able to reveal who's on top of the ladder at the moment amongst the media crew?
No, there's one or two people who I don't know, and actually I've not got the table in front of me, but no, there are one or two people. The people who always seem to do well are those who are not necessarily that prominent as rugby league writers. The more prominent you are, the worse you seem to do normally. It's a strange one, but there's a long way to go. I'll look it up. So next week I'll give you all the information you want. You should have joined it. You should have. I mean, you should have. You should be in it, mate, and then you'd know.
Oh, mate, maybe next year. Maybe next year.
Yeah,
You'll
yeah.
have to also tell us who, out of the whole media landscape over there, who you would like to beat the most. It can just be anyone, as long as you finish above them on the ladder. You have to let us know.
Yeah.
Um, Now, mate, obviously there's been a lot happening, as we touched on at the start of the podcast over the last week or so. But how about we dive into the negotiations that are going on between Super League and NRL? Obviously, Andrew Abdo's been doing a lot of media. I saw him, during the Hull and Saints coverage, talking on the sideline, and he said a lot of things, but I felt like he didn't say much at all at the same time. What did you make of his
Well, he
comments?
didn't get interviewed by me, that's one thing for sure. And he's not come onto this podcast, so we can't question him on what the NRL's objectives are. The thing about Andrew Abdo, Jake, is that he's a very smooth operator. You can see why he's the NRL chief executive, because he handles the media very well. I think he's a very articulate, very eloquent guy. He answers every question, but not necessarily directly. He knows how to deflect questions, so that makes him a very good It'd be a good. I could imagine him as the Prime Minister of Australia, to be honest, at some point. Although, of course, he's a South African, but
Yeah.
he's got very strong political skills. But the fact is that the meeting with the RFL officials, I think he met Nigel Wood, Rhodri Jones. They had somebody from Deloitte's tuning into the meeting as well, who've been newly appointed to advise the RFL on this potential deal. The thing was that there was no proposal tabled. The RFL hasn't put a proposal forward either. So they were just sort of, it seems, feeling each other out. And Andrew Abdo made this slightly strange point in a way that, the meeting had given him the opportunity to learn more about the governance, the way that the governance of the RFL operates. But my response to that was that, well, he should have known that already, really. It seems odd for him to come over and to have to be given a sort of tutorial by the RFL in how the RFL operates. I would have thought that was, a piece of information that it would come pre-armed with, really. And the real question is, I mean, he's made it very plain that if the NRL comes on board, it will come on board in the form of a partnership, not necessarily with the NRL controlling everything. But precisely how that is going to operate is not at all clear. What the NRL's objectives are. I mean, Andrew Abdo, to give him credit, did make the point. The NRL is very keen to expand the footprint of rugby league globally, and that obviously makes great sense. And the thing about the United Kingdom, Jake, is that there's far more potential for expanding the footprint of rugby league here than there probably is in the Australasian market, because once you've got Perth Bears on board, the only major city in Australia that's not got an NRL team is Adelaide. And then you've got the New Zealand cities, Wellington, by the way, which is hosting a Anzac Day game this Saturday, and has sold out 34,900 tickets for that Anzac Day game with the Warriors. Who are they playing? They're playing the Dolphins, aren't they, in Wellington? So that's an amazing achievement to sell out that complete stadium. That's a stadium that even the All Blacks fail to sell out sometimes. So, the level of support for the Warriors is quite fantastic. And in New Zealand, and there's got to be enormous scope there for a second New Zealand team. But we found, as I say, that it's moving at a. I mean, we've been talking about the NRL taking an interest in English or Northern Hemisphere rugby league probably for the last 18 months. So, quite frankly, the progress should have been far greater in that time than it appears to have been. And the complicating factor here is that the Super League is currently negotiating its new TV contract that has to begin next year. And it's negotiating with Sky, it's negotiating with TNT, the organisation that I think is owned by Warner Brothers now. And TNT are apparently making a very serious bid because I think they already broadcast Premiership Rugby Union. And the theory is that they might like to have a channel dedicated to rugby of both codes, which we see on Sky, for example. Sky have got a golf channel, football channels, obviously, tennis channel, and during the season they've got an NFL channel. But Sky don't have a rugby channel because they don't broadcast rugby union. So TNT are making a serious bid for the game, and there is a potential possibility of the of Super League taking up that offer. So that would be potentially very, very exciting, I think, particularly if they did create a rugby channel and it allowed the broadcast not just of Super League but of Championship games as well. That would be highly significant, Jake, to be honest. So I could see Rugby League moving to TNT if all the dominoes or the cards fell in the right way, and but it would be a big break to leave Sky, I've got to say. But nonetheless, if the offer is the right one, then there'd be every reason to do that, I think.
Yeah, mate, that's some really interesting insight there.
And they've got to do that soon, and they can't wait for the NRL. The point is, they can't wait for the NRL to make up its mind precisely what it wants to offer, and that's crazy. I mean, there was a lot of talk about the NRL wanting to switch us back to winter, which would be ridiculous. And I think Andrew Abdo has now rowed back on that a bit. I think he's realised that would be unpalatable to the vast majority of clubs over here. But he was asked an interesting question by one reporter who said if the clubs don't vote in favour of an NRL deal, if the Super League clubs don't vote in favour of an NRL deal, would you then make a separate offer that wasn't connected to the RFL for something like an NRL Europe competition and try and persuade the clubs to leave the leave the RFL rather, and join your organisation? And he didn't deny that. He more or less said, we've got to see whether we can reach an agreement, but if we can't reach an agreement, you never know what alternatives might be available to us. So he did seem to suggest that they might want to encourage a breakaway from the RFL, and there are some clubs that are dissatisfied with the RFL. Wigan and Hull are probably the two major ones that probably would jump if the NRL was to make an offer that completely cut across the RFL. Whether they could take any other clubs with them or not is pretty dubious, I would think. Of course, a lot might depend on money because, of course, money does tend to solve a lot of problems, doesn't it? And if the money is available and it's sufficient, then some clubs might be very tempted, especially those that don't have a major, very wealthy backer. So who knows? It's an interesting one, but certainly I don't think the majority of supporters would want to see the NRL coming in and breaking up the RFL. But we'll see. It's going to be an interesting period.
Yeah, and like that deadline that has been floated was the end of May. The NRL wanted to come to some sort of deal or finish negotiations by that date. But it sounds like a lot of that
that's
is
when the RFL want to sort out their TV contract.
Yeah.
That date more or less coincides. So there's going to be a lot of very careful balancing. It's a balancing
Mm.
act over the next few weeks, I think, Jake. At the moment, it's not easy to predict what the outcome is going to be.
It sounds like as well the NRL really want the Super League, or I guess the RFL, to create some sort of independent governing body that replicates the structure we have here in Australia.
Well, it already does. The RFL is run by an independent governing body, mate. You know that's already in place. The directors of the RFL don't have club affiliations. I know Nigel Wood used to have at Bradford, but and the directors of RL Commercial, they, I mean, there are two club, representatives on that body. The thing about the independence, there are two areas where the clubs have a important say in British Rugby League. One is that the Super League clubs it's in their power to say how many clubs should be in Super League. So it was the clubs last year that decided that Super League would increase from 12 to 14. And the other area of power is that they've got the right to accept or decline any broadcast offer that's made. So if Sky make an offer, or if TNT make an offer, or if anybody else makes an offer, a broadcast offer for Super League, the Super League clubs can either accept it or reject it. So if you were going to say that the governance should be entirely independent, then you would take away those two powers from the clubs. Again, I'm not sure that the clubs would necessarily go for that, but you never know. They might if the offer was sufficient. But again, this idea that the NRL is run by a totally independent commission with the clubs having little influence, that's an absolute nonsense, because I'll give you as the evidence the Perth Bears. Now, the Perth Bears are going to come into the competition next year, and they will get absolutely no favours, either in terms of salary cap, in terms of player recruitment, or in terms of financial distribution. They will get no favours because the NRL has made it clear that the other clubs, the other 17 existing clubs in the NRL, believe that it would be unfair to give one club any advantage over the others, even though it's absolutely vital for the NRL that the Perth Bears have a successful launch. It's very important for the Perth Bears to be successful, to consolidate a footprint in Perth in the same way that the Melbourne Storm have done in Melbourne, because Perth is AFL territory, just as Melbourne is, and yet the NRL has got an immensely successful NRL club in Melbourne, which many people thought could never happen, going back to the early years of this century. And you've got to do the same thing in Perth. You've got to give Perth a chance to really shine, sign some top players and get some salary cap dispensations and so on that would allow them to, sign some real star players to be a great success right from day one. But the NRL has not done that because it would face a rebellion from the other clubs. So let's not pretend that the NRL is run by a totally independent commission who don't need to take account of what the clubs say, because they clearly do. And it's the biggest load of nonsense ever to say that the NRL clubs themselves don't have any power. The fact is that the NRL clubs do have lots of power in the NRL, but they're all very happy to sit back and let the money roll in because of the increasing financial returns that they're getting from broadcasting over the years, and the increased return that they expect to get from 2027. So, or from 2028, I should say, when their new contract will kick in. But the idea that any governing body is totally independent of clubs is an absolute nonsense, because the clubs are the stakeholders, and you never get you'll never get absolute independence. But I must say, looking at Australian sport, the AFL Commission, the Aussie Rules Commission, is much more independent than the NRL Commission, and it takes decisions that are much more for the good of the game as a whole, rather than for the good of the clubs that are in the game, if you see what I mean. And that's why they've expanded so much over recent years. Although, to be fair, some of the expenditure that they've incurred, particularly in Sydney, in trying to infiltrate into Western Sydney, is money that's not been spent very well, it seems. But nonetheless, they are if you're looking for an independent governance, then they give us the best example, certainly in the UK or in Australia.
Mm. Yeah, I was trying to read between the lines in what both Rhodri and Andrew were saying in their interviews, and it made me wonder whether, how much detail had been revealed behind closed doors that we aren't aware of, and then, has the NRL given them an ultimatum that, if you want our investment, you have to do it this way? Is it a matter of all the stakeholders in the English game coming together to get on the same page? I remember Andrew had an interesting point that, for this to work, they do need everyone heading in the same direction in England. And it does make me wonder after May if they aren't able to come to some sort of agreement, is the NRL just going to steamroll ahead and forge their own competition over there? And I wonder if that's why they've set that hard deadline.
Well, who knows? And as I say, I mean, they met last Thursday. It's nearly a week now since that meeting. Andrew Abdo is no doubt back in Australia now, and there will no doubt be, documents flying backwards and forwards between the two bodies, setting out the position of each. And at the end of the day, both of them, both the RFL and the NRL, want to promote rugby league and want to develop the game, better than it's been developed at the moment. And I've said before, when I several months ago, I said to the wrote a piece actually saying that the RFL should be looking to get the NRL to help to take advantage of the weakness of rugby league in certain places such as Wales, where rugby union's going through a really hard time at the moment, and we should be establishing a major club in Swansea, for example, which is a great. We've had some great rugby league players come from Swansea over the years. Fewer in recent years, of course, since that game went professional, but nonetheless, there's still a significant residual interest in rugby league down there. And if you had a club formed to play out of the Liberty Stadium in Swansea, I think it would get good support, and particularly if it was a strong club right from the off. So, we ought to be investing some of that NRL money in doing that. And in doing that, Jake, it would help attract Welsh players into our sport and, create hopefully a vibrant Welsh national side eventually, which would be a great thing. We've seen all these South Pacific Island sides get so strong in the southern hemisphere. We need to see France and Wales, and ideally Ireland and Scotland, if possible, developing to the same extent in the northern hemisphere, so that we've got a much stronger international competition worldwide. And I think there's a great investment in Wales waiting to be made if somebody will make the case for it.
And you touched on it earlier as well, mate. We do have evidence of that working with New Zealand at the moment. I think we're hearing from a lot of fans over there that rugby league has overtaken rugby union, which is something 10 years ago, no one would think that was possible.
No, you wouldn't have dreamed of. And for the Warriors to get that sort of crowd, almost 35,000, selling out a stadium in Wellington, and they did it 10 days before the game, so it's been an absolute incredible development, really. And as I say, there's a new stadium now been built in Christchurch, which incidentally is going to be used for the first time this weekend, because the Super Rugby teams are going to have what they call a Super Round there, with like our Magic Round. Of course, they copy everything we do. They're going to have a sort of Magic Round in Christchurch to open that stadium. So the first games are going to be played there this weekend, and that's that will be worth watching, actually, just to see what the stadium looks like, Jake, because it's a stadium that, in my view, will be begging for an NRL team to be based in Christchurch, and I think the NRL certainly ought to go there. Oddly enough, the club that objects to that is the Warriors. The Warriors don't want. They seem to want to be the only club in New Zealand. I don't know why, because it's very obvious that if there was a second club in New Zealand, the local rivalry would be tremendous, and both clubs would benefit. But again, it seems that the NRL Commission is reluctant to cut across the views of the Warriors Club, which again, it seems goes back to this independent governance thing. They seem to be frightened of making a decision on a second team in New Zealand because of what the Warriors think. Well, the Warriors are doing great, and you've got to give them enormous credit. But the idea that the Warriors fan base would be cannibalised by a new club in Christchurch, which is about 1,000 miles away from Auckland. I'm not quite sure what the actual distance is, but it's on the South Island as opposed to the North. The idea that the Warriors' support would in any way be diminished by a new club in the South Island is just too ridiculous for words.
They're just being greedy, mate. They don't want to lose any fans.
Well, it's like the Broncos for many years said there should never be another team in Brisbane because they'd lose their fans. And the Dolphins have come into the competition and they've not lost any fans, have they, the Broncos?
Mm. No, and certainly not, mate.
They've created a great local rivalry, which is fabulous. And the Dolphins, and it's interesting, isn't it? The Dolphins are the team going to New Zealand this weekend to play in this sellout game in Wellington.
Yeah, I can't wait to watch that one, mate. I think it'll be a tremendous atmosphere. I wish I could go over there and watch it, but maybe when the Warriors eventually play in this new stadium, I'll have to book some tickets and head on over and watch it myself. So, mate, expecting a deal will be done by the end of next month after all this talk? What are you thinking?
Well, there's got to be a deal done before too long. Whether it'll be done by the end of next month, it's a tight schedule now. I mean, what date is it today? It's the 22nd. So that gives us just over a month to agree a deal, and a deal on which no progress has been made so far after 18 months. So can we get 18 months of what should have been 18 months of negotiations into a 1 month period? Maybe, who knows? When there's a firm deadline, people often act in a way that they recognise the urgency, but I'm not sure. Who knows?
Yeah, I think the best approach for them would be to come to some sort of smaller scale partnership over the next 1 or 2 years to try and, I guess, build that relationship and work together to try and figure out what a longer term partnership might look like.
It's an interesting one, mate. You ought to be involved in all of this, mate. Maybe you ought to. Maybe Andrew Abdo ought to give you a call and get some advice from you.
Well, that's the thing. It doesn't have to be groundbreaking from the jump. It can just be like an advisory sort of style partnership for the first 12 to 24 months with a little bit of investment from the NRL because they've probably got a little bit of cash they could afford to invest. And then, look at maybe building on that in years to come. So, mate, we'll see what happens. We'll probably be banging our heads against the wall come the end of next month if a deal hasn't been done. But, mate, we'll move on to some other big news, and it comes with great joy that this deal has, or looks to be done. It looks like England are going to appoint Brian McDermott as the new head coach. What do you make of this reported appointment?
Yeah, it's not been confirmed by the RFL, who are going to confirm the appointment on tomorrow, which is St George's Day, the patron saint of England. They think it's a symbolic day to make the announcement, which I suppose it is. Brian had enormous success at Leeds Rhinos, won several grand finals with the Rhinos. He's, of course, been in Australia now for quite some time, coaching as an assistant coach at Newcastle. And then he's moved up to join Josh Hannay at the Gold Coast Titans. And but he's kept a pretty low profile, to be honest, over, since going to Australia. And it's interesting that he wanted the job. And of course, some people said, well, the disadvantage in appointing Brian is that he's based in Australia, so he's not, in a Super League environment, seeing on a week-to-week basis what the potential players in his squad are capable of doing. But obviously, he's able to view that from a distance. Distance is not a problem in the modern world in the way that it would have been in the old days. And he obviously, assuming that the report is correct, that he's got the job, then he obviously impressed the interview panel, and which included Kevin Sinfield, incidentally, who, of course, played for him. He was Brian McDermott's captain for many years at Leeds Rhinos, so Kevin knows intimately what Brian is capable of and what he's like as a coach. And I just hope that the conditions of his contract do commit him to speaking to the media far more than Sean Wayne used to do. Sean, in many respects, is a great coach, but didn't really like media duties. And it's very important for the England coach to be made available to the media on a regular basis. And we've not been told yet, at least at the time that we're speaking. I don't know whether something will come out later today that says Brian will be available for a Zoom conference, for example, with members of the Rugby League media. I hope he is, but I'm just not sure that he will be. But we need to. He needs to start generating a bit of a feeling for the England squad. He needs to start talking about the England players who might be in his squad. He needs to be talking about the World Cup itself, because very few people are talking about the World Cup, Jake. The World Cup is going under the radar. It's almost as though it doesn't exist. And we get far more talk about the Rugby Union World Cup in the following year, which is also being played in Australia, than we do about this year's Rugby League World Cup. And that's just ridiculous, really. And we need to. What I find frustrating is that there is a team that is supposed to be organising and promoting and running the World Cup, but we don't hear from them much, and that's so incredibly disappointing, really.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like now that they've shortened the number of teams in the World Cup, people aren't taking it as seriously now, which is very
No,
disappointing.
wouldn't,
But
would they? No, it used to have
no,
16, and
mm,
the problem was that the people who ran the last World Cup in England with 16 teams, they actually made a complete hash of organising the pool groups. The pool groups, when it was really successful, the pool groups were seeded, but this time the pool groups were not seeded in the same way. When it worked well, there were two senior, what you might call two top groups and two minor groups, and that allowed for far more equality of teams playing each other. But the organising committee for the last World Cup, in its wisdom, decided to do away with that, and that was just ridiculous, really. And I suspected it would be a washout from the moment they made that decision, and sadly, with a few exceptions, that's what it proved to be. And but they've now gone down to 10 teams, and I think that's a very retrograde step, Jake. I do think it's a strongly retrograde step, and it's disappointing. And I think, as you say, the result of it is that people don't take it as seriously as they would do if it were a larger competition.
mm. Yeah, for sure, mate. And yeah, think about those countries who have now been left out for this year's World Cup. You know, do they feel like they must feel like they've been forgotten about almost? And
Well,
it
yes, I'm
makes them
sure they do.
question their investment. Do they?
I'm
Is it
sure they
worth
do.
us continuing to invest? That sort of thing. So
Precisely, yes.
yeah, mate, disappointing. Hopefully, this will be the start of increasing the teams involved in this fixture, and hopefully the action on the field will be enough to create some hype around it. Because even here in Australia, I feel like they're not promoting it as much as they should be.
Well, gosh, no,
Um,
no,
mm,
no, they're not at all.
yeah,
And I think, I mean, I think it's been badly organised. I think the splitting it into three groups, one of four, two of three, is just ridiculous. And there are a lot of things that are wrong about it. And I don't know who they consulted before they did it, but they certainly didn't consult anybody who had any, um, you know, great insight into how to organise a World Cup with such a limited number of teams.
no, for sure, mate. Now, some other news, mate. We touched on a little bit about Rhodri Jones. He's stepped in as the interim CEO for the RFL. Abi Ekoku's taking on the chief exec role with the Saints, I believe.
He is, yes, yeah.
Yeah, and who knows how long Rhodri will remain interim? But I guess is there any other names were any other names being floated around to take over, or is it always going to be Rhodri?
Oh, well, I don't know. I mean, it's an interim role, and they have advertised for the new chief executive, and it's. I mean, the RFL in the last 12 months or so has had some trouble with Sport England, and one of the Sport England requirements is that they do advertise and appoint a genuine chief executive and give um, a wide range of candidates the potential to take that job. So, I mean, I do know one or two of the candidates who are in for it, but unfortunately, they've asked me to not reveal their names at least at this stage. But there is one guy who I know who I think could be very interesting in the role and would recognise, I think, that how important good media coverage is, and would be very aggressive in promoting that idea. So, I think it's not a done deal that Rhodri will get the job permanently. It may do, who knows? But some people are saying, well, it's just a jobs for the boys thing. Well, I don't think it necessarily will be, and I think we'll have to wait and see how it goes.
Yeah. All right, mate. Should we jump into this weekend's matchups, or is there any other important points you
No,
want to touch on?
that's we've had a great discussion about that, mate. So yes, let's have a
Yeah.
look at this week's Super League games.
All right, mate. Well, straight off the bat, Thursday night. Love a good Thursday night match. Lee Leopards taking on Huddersfield.
Well, this week you've got two, mate. Two Thursday night games. Lee versus Huddersfield. Lee are sort of slowly rising up the table after a bad start. 3 wins from 8 games. They won at York at the weekend in not a totally convincing style, but they've got players coming back. Huddersfield had 2 wins after losing 5 straight at the start. They played Leeds at the weekend and got hammered last Friday night. It was a one-sided game, and some of Huddersfield's defensive frailties were there for everybody to see. So I think Lee will win this game fairly convincingly by about 16 points. I don't think Huddersfield will be able to mend their defence in the limited amount of time that they've got available.
In the other matchup, mate, we've got York taking on Toulouse. Battle of the promoted.
Yes, and I think that's going to be a real enjoyable game to watch, actually. And you remember last year Toulouse won the Championship Grand Final. They came over to York, and York hosted it, but Toulouse won it. And I think it was 10-8 the final scoreline, but I think Toulouse won it with 5 penalty goals, if I remember rightly. So, it's going to be a tight one. I have a funny feeling that Toulouse might just manage to sneak a win again, but I'm not confident in saying that. And between now and then, I might change my mind, Jake. So Toulouse by 2 points again, let's say, And maybe York will have learnt the lesson and they won't give away too many penalties this time.
Yeah, I forgot about that match. The 10-8 scoreline with 5 penalty goals, man. Who
Yeah, yeah.
who would have thought that was how you're going to win a game, you know?
Hmm.
Um, Moving on to Friday's matchup. So we have also a big one, Warrington taking on Wigan.
Oh, it's always a big game. And Warrington and Wigan both lost at the weekend. Warrington got beaten fairly convincingly in the end by the Catalans in France. That was Catalans' best performance. We'll talk about them in a moment. But Warrington, I think they'll come back again, and I think they'll probably beat Wigan, especially Wigan without Bevan French and Harry Smith. I think they might be too strong for Wigan. I'd say Warrington by 10 points. I think they'll
Uh,
want to bounce back strongly.
yeah. In the other or one of the other Friday night matchups, we've got Castleford taking on Hull FC.
Well, Castleford had a great win, didn't they, at Wigan at the weekend? But they seem to struggle a bit at home. They just don't seem able to win games at home. They lost recently at home. They got hammered by Wakefield. In fact, they got nilled at home. And that was, despair for Ryan Carr and for the Castleford supporters. And, you wondered where they were, what they were going to do after that a defeat on that scale. Well, the response was to go to Wigan and win. And you couldn't ask for a better response than that. So, and the other complicating factor for this game is how Hull will play for Andy Last, and that remains to be seen. But I think Castleford, with that momentum they've got by winning at Wigan, it might just give them the momentum to put one over Hull, and I think they probably will, but not very convincingly. So I'd go for a 6-point win for Castleford.
Yep, a nice tight one. Now the final Friday night matchup, we've got Leeds taking on Catalans.
Well, I mean, if Leeds play like they did against Huddersfield and Catalans play like they did against Warrington, then we've got a great game in store. And I'd hesitate to say who would win it, but I think Leeds probably would, simply because they're playing at home in front of their own fans. And of course, you're never quite sure. Catalans are a funny side. They are a side that is capable of playing extremely well one week and then quite badly the next week. So I don't think they've developed any consistency yet. So I think I'm going to go with Leeds to win by about 12 points. I think Leeds will hold on to win.
Now again, mate, on that night we're faced with the headache of picking which match to watch. Which one are you going to watch live tomorrow night?
Well, I think the thing about if I don't go to a game, and of course it's tempting not to, because you see more games in a strange way by not going, don't you, these days?
Yeah.
I think I'd be tempted to watch the Leeds Catalans game live and record the Warrington Wigan one to watch that afterwards. So I think that would probably be my strategy if I was sitting on the couch at home.
Mm, yeah.
But we'll see. We'll see.
You're kind of forced into a position where you've got to pick off of the last weekend's matches and what form you watched in that match, because
Yes.
you only have recent history to go off. But mate, moving on to we've got a Saturday matchup here. We've got two Saturday matchups here. Bradford taking on Hull KR.
Well, Bradford v Hull KR is the one game this weekend that I feel confident in predicting, and it's got to be a Hull KR win. Hull KR are now firing on all cylinders after that shocking setback in Las Vegas against Leeds. That's now firmly in the rearview mirror, and I think Hull and Bradford are really struggling for players at the moment. They've got such an injury list. I think it's going to be a pretty one-sided game, and I think Hull KR will win by at least 30 points, to be honest, and which is a shame because Bradford have really set off quite well in Super League this year, but injuries are catching up with them and, are going to really slow them down, and I think that will happen this weekend.
In the final matchup of the round, mate, St Helens taking on Wakefield.
Well, again, another game that's hard to predict, and it's it's third against second. St Helens are third, Wakefield is second. Wakefield struggled to beat St Helens though, so I think Saints will probably prove to be a bit too strong. I think they might win by about 10 points, but Wakefield, are really playing extremely well at the moment, and don't be too surprised if they scored 52 points against Bradford at the weekend. Admittedly, a weakened Bradford, as we've already said. But don't be too surprised to see Wakefield performing well. But I think at the end of the day, it'll be Saints by about 10 points.
Well, mate, it's an exciting weekend of matchups. There'll be a few close games there. I'm looking forward to it.
And a great weekend in the NRL as well. Anzac weekend, isn't it? With all the the formalities that go with Anzac weekend, the remembrance of the great people who have fought and died for Australia and New Zealand in the world wars. And I think you're going to have several sellout games this weekend in Australia, starting on Thursday with West Tigers and Canberra Raiders at Leichhardt, which is one of my favourite stadiums, and going on right to Manly versus Parramatta, the last game of the weekend at Four Pines Stadium, with Manly having improved so dramatically under Kieran Foran, and Parramatta playing brilliantly last weekend against Canterbury. So what a great weekend it's going to be, and we've got the St George Illawarra, having sacked their coach, playing the Roosters on Saturday at Alliance Stadium in Sydney. I hope that's a sellout as well. So it's a great weekend in Australia, Jake, and I'm very tempted to take out a Watch NRL subscription just for this weekend, just to see all these games, because they're all incredibly compelling games, I think, and it's going to be fascinating to see how it all goes.
Oh, yeah, for sure, mate. I wonder if there's a free trial you could sign up to for 48 hours or so to watch some of those matches.
It would be nice.
I love, yeah, and like you said, the Anzac Day matches, they always bring the atmosphere and the emotion, and I'm quite excited to see how my injury-depleted Broncos go against the Bulldogs this weekend. I think the Broncos are struggling to field a side for that matchup with all of their injuries.
Yes.
So
it's in the Super League, is it? We are getting to the point at which we've got to sort of ask the question, and we're going to publish something this week in League Express that does precisely this. What is the game now so collision based that it creates too many injuries? And I think there's a very strong argument to say that. But the question then, of course, is how would you modify it to try and produce fewer injuries? That would be a challenge for the people who run the game, but it's a challenge that they might want to start thinking about, because it's not just head injuries these days, is it? Players are getting, all sorts of injuries that, at any one point is keeping a lot of them out of action. And it's very frustrating, I think, for the fans and for everybody, and obviously for the players most of all, that have to miss so many games. So we'll just have to see how it goes.
I'll have to send you an email, mate, with the RLPA put something out yesterday or the day before talking about this is the result of trying to speed the game up without having proper consultation with the clubs, and I guess dropping those rule changes on the clubs on the eve of the season beginning. They seem to blame the speed of the game now and how fast we've made it for, while we're seeing so many injuries.
We need some proper research. That's the point. We need some research into it. They may be absolutely right. But, we need people who have got some expertise in this field, obviously medical people, medical researchers and so on. Obviously, you and I don't have the required expertise, but nonetheless, what we can simply do is comment on it, really, and point it out. And it's then for others to take up the baton and try and look at explanations of why it's happening and what could be done to make it happen less. That's the point, isn't it?
And if any of our listeners want to give us their take in the comment section under our YouTube video, feel free to chime in and tell us what you think. Is the game getting too quick? But at the end of the day, mate, we're all armchair experts, so we'll leave it to the medical professionals.
Absolutely, yes. And I think we've gone over an hour now, mate. So we better think
Better wrap it
about
up.
wrapping it up. Yeah, yeah. Great to
Yeah.
speak to you.
Yeah, you too, Martyn. All right, mate. Well, let's do it again next week.
We will. Great to see you, Jake. And I hope it's sunny where you are, mate. It's getting sunnier here. We've got lovely spring weather, mate, now. So I'm going
Mate.
to get outside and enjoy it.
Good on you, mate. It is starting to cool down here. Not too cold though. I haven't pulled out my hoodie yet, my jumper.
Mm.
But yeah, I'm sure
Well, I
those times aren't
noticed,
far off.
I was watching the Canberra game just the other day. The Canberra they were playing Melbourne Storm, and one of the sideline commentators said, "Oh, down here in Canberra, I'm on the touchline." He said, "and it's absolutely freezing. It's only 12 degrees." And I thought, God, we'd be sweating with that temperature, mate. So it's just ridiculous. It's
Mate,
amazing how soft you all are in Australia.
mate, we're incredibly soft when it comes to the weather. As soon as it gets below 15 degrees, the big puffer jackets start coming out, and people put 3 layers of clothing on. It's ridiculous.
Just when we start taking everything off, you start putting everything on. Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah. All right, mate. Well, we'll wrap it up here and do it again next week.
Okay, mate. Great to see you.
You too, mate. Cheers.